Blacksite 7, written by Eurytris on Reddit. I'm in the wind. I'm sure I'll be dead by tomorrow, but I need to let people know this thing is loose. I'm an agent with the United States government, and my station is Blacksite 7. I won't tell you my name. It would probably be useless to you. But this was not how I saw my life going. I spent 6 years in Iraq, signed up right after high school. It was nothing like the recruiter told me it would be. I spent 8 years in the blistering heat. I hauled my fair share of comrades out of firefights, and saw a lot of shit over there that would make ordinary people go crazier than I might be. I've had camel spiders crawl on me while I sleep. I watched my friends I've known since basic get decapitated through binoculars, burned houses full of insurgents, and civilians to rubble, and a lot of other things I don't like to think about. When I was done, they gave me my papers, thanked me for my service, and sent me home. I know I have no right to complain. Many guys didn't make it back, but home has been worse. I spent the last 6 years in an active combat zone, and now I was supposed to come home and go back to civilian life? I spent 3 months in the civilian world. 2 of those months were spent in a cruddy apartment because my parents couldn't handle the night terrors and the jumpy marine that had come back. Before I knew it, it wasn't going to work. Every car honk, every barking dog, every firework rattling in the street had me reaching for my gun and breaking into a cold sweat when I couldn't find it. Before TJ found me, I was considering unaliving myself. Then one day, he was just at my door with that big shit-eating grin he'd always worn in the desert. "You look like shit, House. Let's get you some pancakes. I've got something I want to discuss with you." TJ was my platoon leader in the sandbox. They called him the comedian because he was always smiling, always cracking jokes. He was a functional sociopath. Well, I guess most of us were. I always admired his ability to laugh in the face of such screwed up stuff. TJ was not his real name, but since he's still in this stuff that I've left behind, I figure the best I can do is not remind him he's why I'm here. He took me to breakfast, and in the back of a crowded Denny's, and he laid it all out for me. "You've got a bad house," he said through a mouthful of pancakes. "But that's okay, 'cause old Uncle TJ has the cure for you. I've got a new job. Familiar work that might interest you. Ever hear of Two Trees?" I had. Two Trees was a government institute that, on the surface, did a lot of medical research and clinics trials. Underneath, though, they did wet work, and anyone who was involved in covert ops knew about Two Trees. We'd worked with them a few times in Iraq, and their guys were spooky, to say the least. "You're looking at the new head of Blacksite 7. I furrowed my brow at him. "Congratulations. Should I know what that is?" "Of course not. It's a closely guarded government secret. Two Trees is paying me a small fortune to keep it that way, too. The problem is, I need someone to curate the site for me. Someone with military training, experience with firearms, and a need for some normalcy." "Know anyone like that?" I knew what he was asking, but I didn't think I was who he was looking for. I hadn't found work in the 3 months I'd been back, and most of that was because I couldn't settle into anything. I was constantly jumpy, constantly on edge, and that makes it hard to find work. No one wanted you doing security work or minding a gas station when every backfiring car was an enemy combatant. What would happen if I had an episode in the government facility? I shook my head. "Thanks, but no thanks. I don't think I'm fit for duty the way I am." "Yeah, I thought you might say that," he said, putting a metal tin in front of me. "Your medical files read like a benchmark for PTSD. Night terrors, irritability, being on edge, those irrational bouts of anger that got you thrown out of your parents' house, he added with a little smirk. I felt defensive. How do you know about that? You'd be surprised what my level of clearance will get you. Your therapist records were about as hard to get as a beer at a gas station. Well, I've got a little present for you, House. Welcome to the rest of your life, he said, indicating the silver case. The case was about as big as an Altoids tin. There were no markings, no filigree or needless ornament, and it had a distinctly surgical look. I slid my hand towards it, but it didn't seem to want to touch it. Every sense I had told me to walk away now, not to touch it, and just walk away from this unassuming little case. I forced my hand to pop it open instead. Inside was a pair of pale gray gel caps. What are these? These are the answers to your prayers. 2 of these a day and you'll feel as calm and clear as you ever did when you were a mere old lad of 18. No more jumping at every noise. No more reaching for your gun when a dog barks or a car backfires. Just peace of mind. I imagine now that this is what Mephistopheles sounded like when he spoke to Faust. What's the catch? These pills are only available through the Two Trees Corporation. Employees who agree to be part of the clinical trial get them free of charge. But they're only available to employees, he said with a little grin. Take them, take a day to feel the effects, and let me know what you think. Call me tomorrow and give me your answer then. Enjoy a night of freedom, and then make your decision. I took the pills home with me, and after a few hours of staring at them, I took them with some vodka. The effects were instantaneous. If you've never had PTSD, then it's hard to explain, but it's like having a loose wire that someone fixes. And then when you go back to the way you were, my anxiety melted away. My fear dissipated. My unease and dread were gone, and my anger, well, it seemed like a distant memory. I was sitting in my cruddy apartment, surrounded by the trappings of my depression and my anxiety. And suddenly, I felt like I'd boarded a bus in 2003 and headed out to basic training. I was finally comfortable in my own head, and it was like coming back to a safe place after years of running from danger. After the first good night's sleep I've had since shipping out, and I called TJ and told him I was in. One question, I asked. What's in the pills that makes them work so well? He was silent for a long time before saying, You really don't want to know, House. Bag your shit, there'll be a truck to move you to West Virginia in the morning. And that's how I came to work at Blacksite 7. I must have looked like a junkie by the time I pulled up in front of my new home. I didn't have much. The truck had taken all of 4 boxes into the deep woods as I followed in my old compact. The journey took about 16 hours, and by the time I got there, I was starting to feel the anxiety creep back in. I became angry about how slow the truck was moving, afraid that this whole thing was a trick so they could kill me. By the time I arrived, I found myself wanting to die, hoping for death so I could return to the quiet that had been in my head before. That was when I saw TJ standing at the gates of what looked like an old military checkpoint. He flashed that oh-so-knowing smile and handed me another silver case. I dry swallowed the pills without a word, and felt the inner peace warming back across my brain. And then he showed me my new quarters. It was a little bunk room with a bed, a kitchenette, and lockers for clothes. There was a footlocker for my personal stuff, and I was told to keep the space clean. I would be responsible for the site and its security. TJ showed me a terminal off the bedroom with monitors and camera feeds. The compound had cameras all over the place, but I appeared to be the only one here full time. The site's mostly for storage these days, but it's what we get up to here at night that may interest you. That's why you're here. I need someone I can trust to watch this site 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 4 times a year. You'll be relieved for a week of R&R somewhere, but other than that, this is your world. That did not bother me. I had no problem being alone after 3 months of people. What I was curious about was what I was doing out here. What am I looking for exactly? TJ pointed at 3 buildings on the camera. A truck comes in twice a week. Let them through the gate and don't bother them. They'll take what they need from the building and they won't bother you. Keep nosy people out of here. Lethal force is authorized. And don't ever go in there, or I'll have to show you where Blacksite 8 is, he said with a smile. The smile didn't cross his eyes. Don't worry about being vigilant, though. If anything's bigger than a mouse, and it moves out there, the alarms will let you know about it. He told me that my food would be delivered once a week, mostly MREs, and I could order anything I wanted from the terminal in my living quarters. There was a workout yard near the second building, and I could move through the woods if I chose, as long as I took my phone with me to get alerts from the console. By the way, hand me your phone, he said, and when I did, he put it in his pocket and handed me another one. That's your new phone. I'll take the keys to your car too and put the money from it in your account. This is your life now, House, so don't take this job lightly. If you leave the grounds, we'll know. If you try to update social media or try to tell anyone on the outside about what you've seen here, we'll know. If you want to marry or feel like you need out, arrangements can be made from your first 5-year tour. As far as anyone's concerned, you no longer exist. Don't be stupid, put in your 5 years and we'll reassess your position. He grinned again and punched me in the arm. And lighten up, this will be the easiest 5 years of your life. And from that point on, I was an employee of 2 trees. TJ had been right though, the first 5 years flew by. I lived on the site, spending my days working out or watching TV. I played the latest video games and watched the newest movies. Twice a week, as advertised, a truck rolled up and honked. I would check the cameras, open the gates, and they would do the rest. They would honk when they were ready to leave, and I left them alone. The trucks always had the 2 Trees logo on them, and I never heard poop about them. I never tried to get into the warehouses. I had been a soldier long enough to know how to check my curiosity, and the scares were minimal. The food kept coming, the pills that kept me in my right kept coming, and it was pretty peaceful all told. The alarms, to my knowledge, only went off 3 times in that first year, and 2 of those times it was a deer who wandered too close. The first time it happened, I had slunk out in a panic, service pistol in hand and boxer shorts flapping. As I rounded the first warehouse, I drew down on a very surprised doe who darted away before I could draw a bead on her. It was kind of a special moment for me. I had never seen a deer up close, and as it ran away, I was kind of glad I didn't shoot it. The third time the alarms went off, it had been a person. It was the first person I had seen in 3 months. I had been sitting at the console one night, watching the latest Marvel's Avenger movie. I think it was Infinity Wars, when the alarm went off. I paused the movie, expecting to see a deer or rabbit on the monitor. My eyes went wide when I realized it was a person. He had a crowbar, and was attempting to pry the doors open. He must have come out of the woods, because if he had driven up, I'd known about him much sooner. It had been 3 months since I'd seen a person. The last one had been Agent Daughtry, who had come to relieve me for a week of R&R in September. The idea of seeing a person not connected with 2 trees made me feel kind of weird. Even when you were on R&R, you went to a company resort or a company place full of company people. This stopped you from getting a little too drunk and talking about all the stuff you did for your country. It was a great idea, but it meant you had nearly no interaction with civilians. I took my pistol outside and crept up on him in near silence. When my foot came down on an extra crunchy stick, he turned his head and noticed me. He raised the crowbar as if to attack, and well, the rest was instinct. The gun went off without me even having spoken to him, reflex taking over and dropping the threat before it could become a real danger. His left eye popped like an overripe fruit, and he fell down on the hard December ground. I called TJ, and he and some other men in suits came to assess the damage. You did just right, House. He was a threat to the facility and needed to be put down. Don't think for a minute that this reflects poorly on you. What will you do with him? I asked. TJ smiled. Immediate disposal, House. Think you've got the stomach to help us? I found that I did, and once he was doused in gasoline, we set him ablaze on the edge of the property. They gave me an extra week of R&R, and when I came back, TJ must have decided that I was worthy of being bought in on extra certain things. The alarms went off a week after I came back. I saw a black car rolling up through the front gate. TJ stepped out and waved at me. As it stopped on the concrete roundabout, other men getting out as well. I slid my shoulder holster on and went out to meet him. It was 11 p.m., and visits this late were highly irregular. As I approached the vehicle, two other men in suits were bringing a man with a bag on his head out of the car. He was wearing scrubs. The men bound his hands behind his back, and I could hear him crying beneath the black hood he wore. I looked between them, waiting for an expansion, and TJ threw an arm around me and walked me towards the spot where we burnt the trespasser. House, I think it's time that we bring you in on the second reason for the Blacksite. You see, sometimes Two Trees has assets that need to be eliminated. The Blacksites are often used for these purposes. It's always the responsibility of the site's caretaker to carry out these eliminations. Fringe benefits, I suppose you could say. Why wasn't I told about this before? I asked, feeling indignant. I'm no murderer. Oh, well, those combatants in Iraq will be glad to hear that, won't they? He said, almost snidely. That was war, TJ. This is murder. Think of this as war too, House. These people are the enemy, and they need to be eliminated for the good of the public safety. It's part of the job, House, and a part I know firsthand that you're capable of. They put the man on his knees in the middle of the burnt spot. He was praying under the hood as we stood around him. Put him down, House. That's an order, TJ said. I looked at him icily. And if I won't? The two men with him drew their guns, and TJ grinned. Well, then I'm afraid these men will have to execute both of you. Come on, House, don't throw this away over some nobody. He's no different than the man outside this warehouse. I wish now that I'd just let them shoot me, but I guess if I had, you would never know about any of this. Instead, I drew out my gun and put a bullet in his skull, glowering over at TJ as his buddies put their gun away. You made the right choice, House. Who knows, you might not have to do this more than a dozen more times in the next 4 years. I executed an asset a month after that. There were mostly people in scrubs, people in lab coats, doctors, researchers, people who had likely tried to steal from whatever facility they worked at. They were men and women, old men and scared 20-somethings. I never bothered to learn their names. They were just assets to be eliminated. I became kind of numb to the process. We burned them afterwards. Gasoline and fire made it look like they were never there, and the spot near the edge had a charred look to it after a while. At the end of 5 years, TJ came to see me and asked if I wanted to re-up. "What happens if I walk away?" I asked. I was eating dinner when he'd come by, and he sat down to have a plate of fettuccine with me. Given my free time, I had learned to do a good number of things I couldn't before. I became a pretty good cook, learned to play the guitar, read every book on the shelf I had bought to hold them, and there was a chainsaw out back along with some sculptures I had made with it. I couldn't say I hadn't enjoyed my time here, the killings aside, but I was curious to know if they'd actually let me leave. "You'll be allowed to return to the real world, your bank account fuller and your retirement substantial. Just watch what you say out there. I'd have to bring you back in for your replacement to put a bullet in." I ended up signing up for another 5 years. I shouldn't have done that. I was 8 years deep when they bought the girl in the black bag to me. It was 2 a.m. and I started to think about bed when the alarm went off. I saw the town car rolling up and I looked for TJ. He was not the one who climbed out, however. This guy had his hair slicked back, and his suit was a perfect blue pinstripe. He did not wave at me, and I felt a sense of dread as I grabbed my gun. Somehow I expected TJ to be under the bag this time. The man's name was Stein, and he didn't have TJ under the bag. What he did have was a kid with a thick, black hood over their head. I couldn't tell at first if it was a boy or a girl. They were dressed in baggy clothes, Salvation Army rags that a homeless person would be embarrassed to wear, and they were crying loudly under their hood. 2 familiar men had the kid, and they looked stoic about the whole matter. Stein didn't say anything, just led the precision over to the charred spot and put the kid on their knees. When he made me to remove the hood, I did it myself. He winced, but didn't stop me. This was my place, my job, and I had garnered a reputation for being a professional. A reputation I was about to ruin. The bag came off, and the little girl's tear-streaked face came into view in the harsh fluorescence. Her hair was cut short, dirty blonde, and her face was covered in bruises. Her nose looked broken, and her lip was split. The blood trickled down her face like red tears, and they mingled with actual tears as they fell to the damp earth. I sighed, looking at Stein as the gun stayed at the ready. "What the hell is this?" Stein looked surprised. "It's an asset. TJ said you handled these for us. Handle the asset." "This is a freaking kid. Barely old enough to wipe her own butt. What could she have possibly done?" Stein's face was stony. "Yours is not a question, soldier. Liquidate this asset, or be liquidated." I looked up at the kid, her whole face shaking as the tears and blood fell, and thought about watching her head pop like a grape. This wasn't some scared adult, some stoic old man, some praying woman, or some cursing thing with sallow skin. This was a kid. I'd killed lots of people, more in my time here than I ever had during the war, but I was still a professional, and professionals had standards. "No," I said. Stein blinked. "What?" "No, I won't kill a kid. Do it yourself." The 2 men drew their guns, and I was transported back to the first time. I was standing there, 2 days after Christmas, watching TJ grin and tell me the rules. Now I was standing in the woods, the autumn leaves carpeting the ground, feeling sure that it would soon drink both my blood and the girl's. "I will give you to the count of 3 to kill the girl. After that point, you will both be executed. 1. Their guns were unwavering, but so was my resolve. 2. I closed my eyes, preparing to die. 3. I heard a sound like wet concrete splitting open. It was followed by a high-pitched scream and a pair of bodies hitting the ground. I opened my eyes and saw Stein running towards the town car, his composure gone. The 2 men who had been holding me at gunpoint were bleeding out on the ground from large grizzly neck wounds. As I watched Stein run, a rust-red something snapped out and caught him in the back of the neck, dropping him inches from the town car. The red something protruded from the front of his neck, and he grasps futilely at it as he died. I looked back in the direction the thing had snapped out from, and saw the girl was now a mass of red spikes, segmented like spider legs. Her face had split long ways, forcing her to the face of a grizzly, sideways maw. The area between the teeth glowed a deep red, and I could see the eyes on the girl's face blinking erratically, the two halves of her smile grinning at me, and the effect was a little dizzying. I figured for the second time that day I was going to die, but she scuttled off into the woods instead, walking on her strange spider appendages as she crashed through the trees. I stood there for a few minutes, not quite sure I believed I wasn't dead, and then I started running too. I crashed through the woods for hours, running in no particular direction, sure that at any minute a creature or a helicopter from 2 trees would fall on me and either rip me apart or blow me away. I had blundered off with no wallet, no cell, and just my gun and the clothes I'd been wearing. Was the phone how they tracked me? TJ hadn't said as much, but maybe. When the ground went out from under me, I felt the air drop out of my lungs. I fell 5 feet off a mud ledge and skid my hand. My knees hurt when I landed on them, and I realized pretty quickly that I had fallen onto a road. I thought it might be an illusion. The headlights that pinned me to the ground a moment later left me with little doubt. I was kind of numb to the idea of dying by this point, and just lay there, waiting to be run down. Thankfully, the truck stopped, and after a short conversation with the driver, he offered to take me into town. And that's how I came to be here, in this dingy little hotel that happens to have a computer in the lobby. I sold the gun for about $500, and I figure I'll disappear as soon as I'm done writing this. They know I'm gone by now, but I don't know if they think I'm dead or they think I fled. Either way, they'll find me, I'm sure. I'm more worried about that little girl that's loose in the woods, and whatever it is that's living beneath the surface of her skin. If you see a young girl with short, dirty blonde hair, do not approach her. I don't know if she killed those men to get away or if she killed them because she wanted to, but she should be considered dangerous if you encounter her in the wild. And if a man from 2 trees offers you a job, do not become the new curator for Blacksite 7. The job is definitely not all it appears to be.
Hello there. How are you doing on this wonderful night? Today we'll be reading the story of Tin Can Sam. I was a child of the late 80s, a time when kids played on the streets till the street lights came on and riding your bike through town was as normal as going to the corner store to buy your mom's smokes. In fact, the woods seemed to be the only place my dad specifically said was off limits. The woods seemed to be a boundary for many families, and I never knew anyone who went there willingly. It's one of the few things that has stayed the same to this day, though so many other things have certainly changed since I was a kid. One prime example was the telephone. Coming from a small town, my telephone was on a party line, so if you wanted to talk to your friend, you went to his house and did it in person. I was fortunate in that respect. My best friend Davey lived right next door. If I ever wanted to ask him to play G.I. Joe or ride our bikes, I could just walk 20 paces rather than break out my Huffy. Unless that was, we used the tin can phone. The tin can phones were something we had cooked up after seeing it on a science TV show. The guy on the show had hooked up a pair of tin cans together with twine, and showed that no matter how far off they went, you could still hear the other person with the other can. Davy and I had thought that this was just about the coolest thing we had ever seen, and we set about making them. I found a pair of old soup cans and a long spool of mom's twine, and attached the ends to the cans. We could hear each other pretty well, a fact that surprised us to no end. But the farther away we got, the harder it became to hear each other. "Let me show you a different way," Dad had said, startling us since we'd been so involved in our little project. He had linked the cans together with a length of fishing line, and the connection had been the next best thing to crystal clear. We used them a lot, linking our tree houses together with them, and we would talk into the night on them as we camped out in our different tree houses. It wasn't as clear as a telephone, but it was amazing, the conversations we could have had over such a simple little device. When Davy got grounded one summer, it became our only communication with each other too. Davy had gotten himself a little bit addicted to the new arcade that had taken up downtown. The laundromat that had once been there had been cleaned out, but I could remember smelling detergent and fabric softener every time I went in to play a game of Pac-Man or Galaga. Davy and I went there a lot, but Davy seemed to have developed an unhealthy love of games. Any money he could scrape together was shoved into the arcade machines, and I remember noticing that he was absent from school in the middle of the day, and suspected he snuck off to the arcade. When the truancy officer brought him home around lunchtime one day, his parents finally decided that enough was enough. They grounded him for the summer, told him that he might manage to earn some time back for good behavior, but forbade him to go to the arcade until he could get a handle on his addiction. Davy and I talked over the tin can when we could, but Davy made it pretty clear that his parents would take it if they found it. He would camp out when the weather was fair and talk most of the night, Davy's only real connection to the outside world being me. So when I picked up the can one night, calling for Davy through the 100 feet of fishing line, I was unsurprised to hear someone pick up right away. As it turns out, though, it wasn't who I was expecting. "Hello?" said a small voice, and not like Davy's at all. It sounded like an adult trying to do a bad imitation of a kid's voice. "Who is this?" it said again, and I remember shaking off my uncertainty, as I remember that Davy liked to do voices sometimes. Davy and I sometimes listened to the radio DJs prank call people, or we'd catch comedy performances on the satellite TV Davy's family had. Davy had a few characters he had been working on, despite the fact that they all just sounded like him, and I assumed that this was nothing more than another bad character performance. "Who is this?" I challenged back. "This is Sam," the voice said, still high-pitched but getting a little surer of itself as the string made it sound tinier and robotic. But my friends called me Tin Can Sam. Yep, definitely a new voice. If it had been the modern day, I would have said that he reminded me of Herbert the Pervert from Family Guy. It was 1991, however, and all I could equate it to is that funny way that Michael Jackson talked. The voice was funny, kind of, but it also sounded like Davy doing a bit. "Well, Sam, why do they call you Tin Can?" "Because I wear the tin cans. I empty like jewelry and clatter everywhere I go. I'm a hobo, you see, and most of my meals are taken from cans. Who do I have the pleasure of conversing with tonight? I played along and introduced myself to Tin Can Sam. He asked me if I went to school, and I told him that we were out for the summer. He asked if I lived around here, and I told him I lived next door. He asked me how old I was, and if I knew the kid who owned the treehouse, and a dozen other things as I played along. Some of you guys will think that this is weird. Why would I surrender a lot of information that Davy would have already had, if he was already doing a bit? Well, to answer that question, you would have to understand how Davy was when he was doing a character. Davy was one of those people who would commit to a role, even if he was doing a new character. That person didn't know you. Interacting with him was like meeting Davy all over again. But he was my friend, so I put up with it. At least it wasn't Grandma Gerda, who had memory problems and constantly forgot the things you told her. So I played along with the game, asking Sam what it was like to be a hobo. It's alright, I guess. I used to own a hardware store, but people didn't like me very much, so I had to leave. It's rough not having a house sometimes, but I meet so many interesting people on the road. What do you do for fun? I asked, nodding to myself at how thoroughly Davy had committed to the role. Tell stories mostly. You sit around the fire at night and eat your dinner and tell tales. We especially liked scary stories. Scary stories? I asked, a little taken aback. Davy was not a fan of scary stories. He liked to try and play it cool, but he was a scaredy cat at the core of it all. When we watched scary movies together sometimes, he put the volume low so his parents didn't catch us. Davy always hid his eyes and sobbed sometimes when the killer got somebody. Sam liking scary stories was not something I was prepared for. Do you like scary stories? Sam asked, his voice sounding particularly hungry for the answer. Yeah, I said hesitantly. I like scary stories. I've got a really scary story, if you would like to hear it. I nodded before realizing that he wouldn't be able to see me, and I told him that I did. I was still absolutely sure that this was Davy doing a bit, but the longer I listened, the less sure I became. The longer I listened, the more the voice sounded less like Davy and more like a stranger. Good, 'cause it's a really scary story. It's about these kids who were camping out in the woods one night. They didn't have a treehouse like you, but a tent instead. They had set up far from the town where they lived, and they camped at the site often. They came there for a sleepover one night, but they didn't know that there was an extra at their party this time. I sat on the fluffy orange rug I had taken after Mom was going to throw it out, and felt my teeth trying to chatter. If this was a bit that Davy was doing, then it was better than usual. As the string brought his words to me, I remember feeling my spine shudder in the back. This was different. Way different. And I wasn't entirely sure I liked it. As I came up, they heard me. They looked out to see what was making so much noise, peeking from the zipper as they looked into the once inviting wood. It was dark through the woods, and the woods were dense as I moved about, rattling and shaking. They kept looking around anxiously, trying to figure out where I was. The more I moved, the more scared they became. They thought I was a ghost, some sort of spook, and the longer I rattled, the more they shivered. It was windy that night, and I seemed to be everywhere. Okay, Davy, I said, my voice shaking a little as I watched the fire on my lantern dance. I don't like this game anymore. "Who's Davy?" the voice asked. "I told you my name was Tin Can Sam. Now, where was I?" I looked out the windows, trying to see into Davy's treehouse, but the branches of the big oak his dad had built obscured the structure. All I could see was the string as it hung taut between us. Oh, that's right. I could hear them whispering over there, discussing their chances if they ran. They didn't think they stood a chance if they stayed, but if they ran, well, they believed I could only catch one of them. They were arguing, starting to yell, and they got louder and louder. I crept up on their tent. I'd have them then and there, but suddenly they burst out of the tent and ran in every direction. I smiled as they ran, knowing I could easily catch more than one of them. "Stop it, Davy!" I yelled, the story creeping me out when, coupled with the voice that told it, I don't want to hear it anymore. Despite this, I felt unable to take the can from my ear. I caught them. I sliced them and diced them. I cut their throats and sliced out their tongues. I cut their legs and took off their fingers. And when I turned my attention to the third boy, I knew I could get him before he got home. I took off after him, my cans rattling like ghostly chains. He kept glancing behind him, hearing my clatter as I got closer and closer. His feet slapped against the ground, and if he'd hit a single root, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I was so close, my knife still wet with his friend's blood. And as I lunged, he jumped over a small fence and came into his backyard. I stood, watching as he tripped and rolled onto the grass of his home. And when he looked back, I melted into the woods. His race won. I let the can fall to the rug, not wanting to hear anything else, as I scrambled to the ladder of my treehouse and pulled it up. Unlike the children in the story, I was not in a tent. I knew that no one could get me if the ladder was up, and as I dragged it into the treehouse, I could see a shadow as it hunkered at the edge of the fence, separating my yard from Davy's. It was a man, a skinny wisp of a man, with strings of cans hanging off of him. He looked up at me as I looked down at him, and even in the dark I could see his broad white teeth as he grinned. I slammed the trapdoor shut, but even in my safe fortress I wasn't outside his reach. As I hunkered on the carpet, I heard his voice ooze from the can as he left one final word on the matter. "Tell your father he was right to tell you to be cautious of the woods." He may have said more, but I threw the can out the window and heard it tonk as it landed in Davy's yard. I spent the rest of the night with my knees against my chest, jumping at every sound outside as I listened to the clank of cans. I didn't come out when the sun came up, and when someone called my name from the ground, I jumped in surprise. Looking out my window, I was happy to see it was my dad. I came down the ladder, leaping into his arms as I cried against his shoulder. "What's wrong, kiddo? Have a bad night?" he asked, smiling but clearly concerned. I felt him stiffen when I told him what Tin Can Sam had said, and I felt him hug me even tighter. "I'm sorry, kid," he said. "I am so sorry. I never slept in that treehouse again,
And after I told Davy about what had happened, I don't think he did either. I'm an adult now, obviously, and my parents' house is now my house. After my dad died of a stroke when I was in college, and Mom passed a few years later, Melinda and I decided to move into the largest part of my inheritance. Our children love the big backyard, the treehouse that I've refurbished and repaired, but I always warn them to stay out of the woods. They always beg to be allowed to explore, but I've put my foot down where the woods are concerned. I've never seen Tin Can Sam again. But if I ever think that maybe I imagined it, all I have to do is listen carefully on quiet nights. Sometimes, if you listen closely, you can still hear the clank and jangle of old cans as they blow in the breeze. I looked at the ad, unsure if my fever-addled brain was reading right. Wanted, someone to infect me with the V19. Must be verified as ill, have paperwork verifying illness, no older than 2 days from today's date, and be willing to allow me to spend time near you. Will pay $500 for 8 hours in your company. Contraction of virus notwithstanding. Please email me at insert email here. I had only been infected with the virus for 3 days, but I had been affected by the virus for the last 2 months. I had been laid off from work after a drop in profits had caused the store to go into bankruptcy. My boss had been very apologetic, but he still hadn't been able to keep the doors open. We all hit the unemployment line after that, but unemployment wasn't as good as the overtime I had been making before the closure. I had been living a little outside my means, and my bills were starting to pile up. Getting sick has ended my job search, and $500 for doing nothing. More than letting a stranger into my house for 8 hours sounded like a dream come true. I contacted him, and he offered to come over that very night, cash in hand. We discussed hours. I'm a dedicated night owl, and he agreed to come over about 6 p.m. His knock dragged me up out of my stupor at around 5:58, and I staggered up to get the door. I didn't expect to be greeted by a well-dressed man in his mid-30s. I had expected a weirdo, maybe some disease fetishist who got off on being sick, but this guy was surprisingly well put together. He wore black sandals, a button-down shirt, no mask, and his brown hair was close-cropped with square little gold glasses that made him look like a banker. He shook my hand, something no one had done in a while, and took an envelope of money out of his pocket. He showed me the 5 Crips $100 bills, and I led him into the living room. He sat in my armchair, leaning in close as I sagged back onto the couch and stared at me intensely. "So," I asked, "now what do we do?" He shrugged. "Just do whatever you usually do. Watch TV, play video games, whatever. Hopefully my proximity will be all it takes for me to get the disease, and I'll achieve my goal." "I had wondered about that," I said, sneezing into a Kleenex and wincing as he leaned in closer. "This disease is supposed to be pretty bad. Why exactly do you want it?" He chuckled. "I'd tell you, but honestly, it would sound crazy." I shrugged. "It's not like I have anything else to do but watch Netflix for the next 8 hours. Tell me, it'll make the time pass." He glanced over at my bookshelf, eyes roaming, as though he were looking for something, before getting up and taking a paperback from the middle. It was a newer book, Fields of Foregone, and he nodded as he inspected the spine. He must have liked what he'd seen because he smiled and held the book out to me. I see you're a fan of my work. I'll sign it for you if you want me to, but my books are part of the reason I'm here. I squinted at him. Are you Timothy Corvin? The guy who writes the Ghost Grass series? He nodded. Yup. 3-time New York bestseller. I gaped at him for a few seconds before asking my next question. Why the hell are you at my apartment trying to get sick? He smiled, but the smile was sad. You could say that writing is why I'm here. He sat down and made himself comfortable before telling me the strangest story I'd ever heard. I got sick about a month ago. It came on quickly. A cough and a fever. Typical flu-like symptoms, but I assured my agent that it would not be an issue. I'd finish my latest novel and have it on her desk by the end of the month. The first couple of days weren't so bad. I was still lucid, and I managed to get some work done. I was trucking right along, making good progress when the real sickness hit. Suddenly, I was feverish, scatterbrained, and I could hardly focus long enough to get off the couch. I spent my days in a stupor, high on cold medicine and barely coherent. My nights consisted of rolling around in a fever-fueled daze that made me question whether I was dreaming or I was awake. I had these dreams, you see. I say dreams because I can't remember them, but I couldn't do anything but remember them then. I would sit on my couch and mumble about them all day, reeling through their world as I tried to wrap my head around them. I raised an eyebrow at him. That sounds pretty bad. It sounds like you didn't get a lot done. Quite the contrary. The longer I raved about the story, the more I started writing about it. Not so much writing, I guess. I read through my notes the other day, and it was more like drunken ramblings. At some point, I moved on to chronicling them. I would just come to me at my computer, banging away at a story, not sure what I was doing or how long I had been doing it. The stories were great, but they were so far outside of what I normally did that my incoherent brain couldn't wrap around them. As the fever started getting worse, I would slip into these fugue states and just write for hours on end. One day I came out of one and found I had an email from my agent. I had sent her a draft for one of my stories. I was so worried. These stories were weird, completely batty, and I was worried that she would drop me as a client if she read what my fever-swallowed brain had been cooking up. He took a sip from his coffee then, wetting his pipes, and my own fever-addled brain became a little impatient. So, what did she think? Oh, she loved it. She said it was the most unique thing she had read in ages, and wanted to know when I would be done with it. Reading through what I had sent her, and the stuff I was working on before I got better, I could see what she was talking about. It is both similar to so many things, and yet completely different. It's a timeless story that sits completely out of the normal process. It seems to contain two antagonists, and no hero. A war with nothing but loss, and stakes that didn't seem to make any sense. It was almost Lovecraftian, and I found myself as interested in hearing how it turned out as she was, and that's where the problems arose. He looked at my glass of water longingly, and I slid across the coffee table to him. If he wanted to get sick, then more power to him. He was paying, after all, so he might as well get his money's worth. He reached out and brought it to his lips, throat working as he swallowed. I tried not to gag. There was probably backwash in that. My meds were quashing the fever, and the fever was what was keeping me in that altered state of mind. I was always careful never to ride it for too long, but the high was more than a little intoxicating. I would time travel in those moments, starting on my couch and coming to at my computer as I finished more and more pages than I had ever done.
I throttled back on my meds a little, wanting to stretch this out as long as I could. But eventually, my body started to get better. My fever abated, and my fugue states started to become fewer and fewer. I couldn't tap into that hidden world, and this story wasn't something I could just make up as I went along. It was unknown, unheard of, and my mind couldn't begin to tap into that place. My agent was wild to have more, wanting an ending and wanting a sequel, and that's when I started thinking about contracting it again. I lifted an eyebrow at that. I know that's what brought you here. That's what you told me on the phone, but I still have a hard time believing that you want this stuff. It's miserable. Between the headaches and the near constant fever, I seem to exist mostly in a state of misery. Some people are experiencing worse than that too. What if you get a really bad kind and are hospitalized? It seems like that could put a damper on your writing. He shrugged. That's the thing. Even when I'm experiencing the same symptoms as you, I still get the urge to write. I don't know if it's subconscious or what, but my brain takes over and forces my body to write. Maybe it's not even my conscious mind, maybe. It's the place I have tapped into in my fugue state. I have had this thing 3 times now, you know. If I'd had the water at my hand, I'd have done a spit take. 3 times? My God. You rarely hear of anyone getting it more than twice. After I got better the first time, I was struggling to keep up, he said, suddenly looking far away. I tried faking it, but it wasn't nearly the same. My agent started to notice. She started sending my stuff back with notes like, I need more of the voice you had in your first drafts. I started getting very desperate. She told me she had shared my notes with some of her colleagues, and they were very excited about how this would come together. So I started putting the pieces together and decided that I needed to recreate the situation. Ah, I see. You need to get sick again, I said. He nodded. I needed to get sick again. I started slowly waiting in hospitals and walking around looking for sick people, but I became desperate after a while. I got lucky the first time, a chance encounter at a sick friend's house. One trip to their apartment later, and I was back where I started, feverish and coughing on my couch as I waited for the time skips to start. Did they? Would I be still running the ad if they hadn't? Something was different this time, though. The time I was treated to some of the most vivid dreams I'd ever had. I wasn't just hearing about my 2 antagonists' exploits. I saw it. I watched them play their shadow games, maneuver their pieces, snatch territory, and lose it all yet again. All the while I was chronicling them. It became mania for me. I refused to take anything to dull the fever this time, but it didn't seem to matter. After a week, my fevers were abating, and I was back to trying to fake it, but I couldn't fake it, wouldn't even try. I needed the dreams, I needed the visions, I needed the writing fits that I never remembered. That's when I started running the ads. The lady at the paper didn't want to run them, said it was sick, but once I offered to pay her triple the going rate, she caved. I watched him talk about it. I reflected that he looked a little sick. Not physically, but mentally, I mean. He looked like an addict, describing his favorite drug. As he talked, he scratched his arm, his face taking on a smiling rictus as he described his visions. I began to wonder just how this disease, or maybe it was the story, had affected him. I wanted to tell him to leave for his own good, but I really did need the money. I've sunk nearly $5,000 into getting this disease. Did I tell you that? Every time I post the ad, someone responds. After so many times, though, my body has built up antibodies to it, and every time I get it, it's a little bit less effective. The last time I contracted it, I barely had a week. I was so anxious to get some work out of it that I don't think I got more than 30 pages out of the whole week. 30 pages? I gaped. I was no writer, but that seemed like a prolific amount of work from a sick person. I know, it was so disgraceful. The first time I was nearly averaging 30 pages a day, but after the first time I never managed it again. You were getting that much a day? His eyes glazed a little, and he didn't seem pleased with what he saw as he looked at my popcorn ceiling. I see them constantly. I simply can't make sense of it on my own. I can't convey something like storms battling for supremacy, tectonic plates crashing against each other as they try to change the land differently. Their fugues allow me to tap into something primal that could understand these ideas. My puny lizard brain just can't make anything of it. You know, reading these things that I've written, understanding only enough of what I've written, scares me a little. How much of your book have you written? I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. He scratched again, seeming uncomfortable, but still wanting to discuss his drug of choice. I have written 5 books. I've catalogued the lives of these two, from the moment of their births to the very last encounter of the two I've had directly. I gaped at him. He was talking about 5 books in what must have been a matter of months. I couldn't even consider doing something like that, and I began to wonder how large they were. The page volume he talked about per day surely meant these were no small books. He didn't seem to understand where these stories were coming from either, which made them even more mysterious and unknown. Can you tell me about them? He gave me a dead-eyed look, and I regretted asking. It's not something people really want to know in the end. This little experiment started as a way to write the next great fantasy series, but my agent stopped returning my emails about 3 weeks ago. The last 2 endeavors have been solely so I could learn how it ends, how we will end. We? Humanity. We are ultimately the prize that these 2 creatures fight over. More specifically, they fight over the right to subjugate and entertain themselves with us. We see their battles as normal. We see their battles as nothing but the changing of the seasons. But they see them as nothing short of war. I can tell you, but you won't want to know once I'm done. I really didn't want to know anymore, but now I felt like I had to know. In the end, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. He spent the next 10 hours telling me about the battle between the Green Man and the Pale Lady. He told me of their beginnings in Strange, their emergence in exile, and how they came to be on this plane of existence. He told me about the Brandyloo, the servant of the Pale Lady, and the numerous agents of the Green Men. He told me how this Green Warrior was worshipped as a pagan deity, how he took his sacrifices, and how he sought out those who ran. It's funny how 10 hours can seem like a half hour, when something is telling you about eldritch deities. When the alarm on my phone went off, reminding me to take my meds, I realized that it was 6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. Timothy got up, checking his phone, and seemed to realize that he had been talking all night. I seem to have gone over my time a little. Here, as promised, he said, taking out an envelope and handing it to me as he made to leave. Wait, I said, dropping the envelope and coming shakily off the couch. How does it end? He looked back at me and shrugged. Hopefully, I'll find out. And if I do, I will let you know. He then left, and I wouldn't hear from him again for another 3 months. Well, I'd never see him again, but he would make good on his promise. I felt better by the end of the week, my fever breaking and my head getting better and better.
I finally acquired a negative test and started looking for work again. I got lucky. The bar up the road was hiring, and they needed someone to start right away. They had only recently been allowed to reopen, and the bartender was working double duty with no barbacks to help out. Before I knew it, I was bussing tables and hauling kegs as an old pro. I enjoyed the work, though it wasn't something I had ever done before, and it felt nice to get back to work after such a long absence. And then one afternoon, I got a bit of a shock. I was helping my boss open, flipping on the TVs and preparing to tune into one of the several sports channels we often had on, when I saw a little squib on the news that made me stop. I had caught it towards the end of the broadcast, and the name on the article made me stop in the midst of flipping channels. And the city is mourning the death of the local writer Timothy Corvin, who died of the V-related symptoms in St. Graham's this morning. Mr. Corvin, the writer of the Ghost Grass series, is survived by his father and his older sister. Services will be held Tuesday for his friends and family. I couldn't believe it. The guy had been in my house not even a month ago. Had I killed him? Had he contracted his fatal disease from me? I had to sit down. I didn't know what to make of it. My boss must have noticed that something was off because he tried to send me home, wondering if I still had some latent fatigue from being sick. I told him I was fine though, and went back to work. As I worked, I wondered if he'd discovered the end I was looking for. I got the answer in my mail 2 months later. The package was waiting on the stoop. I hadn't ordered anything, and the return address was from Samantha Drimburn. The delivery address was mine, though, so I bought it inside and opened it. Inside was a manuscript, bound with twine, with no title across the surface. On top of the journal was a typed note from Mrs. Drummond, informing me of the package's purpose. Hello, my brother requested that I send this to you if he should pass. He was very adamant that it be placed in your care. All the best. I lifted out the journal, opening the front page, bearing a message written in a shaky hand.
I found the end. Let's hope it helps you after I'm gone.
I've been sitting here, looking at the book for close to an hour, not sure if I should read it or burn it. If the beings Timothy had talked to about have been using his infected body as a mouthpiece, I'm not sure I want to open my mind to them. This book contains their history, contains their past, present, and future, and this knowledge was gained at the cost of a life. Will they come to infect me if I subject myself to this arcane wisdom? That knowledge scares me more than a little, as I put the journal back in the box and carried it to my room. I've decided to put it in the closet for now. Some things are better left unknown.